that is no longer really accepted as terminology. It's kind of the same way that language evolves in any other way. So when we think about the history of psychology and people that had cognitive or organic impairments for a long time, they have made this shift from where at times it was socially acceptable to use the term moronic or retarded, and these terms have phased out. And now that's like, oh, we don't want to say that when we talk about someone who has a cognitive impairment or an organic impairment. It's the same with intersex. People that are intersex would typically prefer to be called intersexed versus hermaphrodite because of the negative connotation. And while we're talking about negative connotation, I'm going to highlight queer. That is a huge umbrella term. It can be orientation or gender identity related. It can be politically related. It is a reclaiming of a word. However, you have to know your population and you have to know what the language the client prefers is, because there are still very many people in the community that is not an acceptable term. That is usually the word queer is taken on by the younger LGBTQ population. For instance, I would not, if someone said, oh, you're queer, I would automatically think, oh, you're insulting me. It is a trigger term for some people, so you would want to know your population. And because it's an umbrella term, it can be used interchangeably with other monikers. And so where some people may be completely comfortable saying that they are gender queer, other people may prefer to say I'm gender fluid. The terms are interchangeable. They mean the same thing. They mean that you are floating between masculine and feminine in your gender identity, but one is preferred to the other. Questioning is just when your client is unsure or an individual is unsure about their gender identity or orientation, or they're just experimenting with their orientation. And then asexual is another huge umbrella term. There are many websites you can go to. There's not very many of them that are scholarly per se. But what's interesting about asexual is a lot of people, when they think asexual, the first thing that comes up is, oh, well, these people don't have sex with people or they don't enjoy that, when actually it can mean a number of things. There are asexual individuals that call themselves sex repulsed or SR, where they do not like the idea of it. They don't want to engage in it. They find that intimacy in other ways with partners. That does not mean that they don't have relationships with other individuals. And then there are people that, there are certain individuals that feel that something such as demisexual falls under the asexual umbrella. And demisexual is when you have an individual who has to have a strong emotional connection with someone to engage in any sort of sexual act with them or to be intimate with them at all. And so now we're going to talk about separating the sexual from affectional. Language really matters. It matters for our comfort level. And a lot of this presentation, I'll go ahead and say, is based on kind of the way we use language and my opinion of how language can affect the way we process information. And so when we think about orientation, a lot of people refer to it as sexual orientation. But sexual orientation is dated and it's kind of presumptuous. When you're asking someone what their sexual orientation is, it can be construed as, well, who do you have sex with? Instead of who do you form relationships with? Who do you find intimacy with? Because just as we could see from the terms that we just went over, like asexual, you may have an individual that does not find that they want to engage in any sexual activities with someone, but that doesn't mean that they can't have an intimate relationship. And so again, it just replaces that idea of who you're attracted to with who you have sex with, and that kind of breaks it down on such a meaningless level as far as what these relationships are. Some people that I have spoken to and had personal communication with, they don't like the idea of it being called sexual orientation because of that. They feel like they are being looked at as an object, and they feel that it encourages people to discriminate against them because they're not looking at them as two people in love. They're looking at them as just two people that are having a physical relationship with one another. And again, it may lead to biases or uncomfortableness. It may prevent professionals from asking questions that may be relevant to the counseling process. I mean, this may not even be based on the word sexual orientation. This could just simply be based on living in the world of heteronormativity, which is where, when you live a heterosexual lifestyle, that you don't necessarily take into consideration other orientations. So if you have a client that comes in and they're sitting down talking to you about their spouse, and their spouse has a gender neutral name, it may be easy just to assume or infer, oh, well, they're talking about someone of the opposite sex. And so now we're going to differentiate between orientation and gender, because LGBTQIA almost seems like an all-encompassing community, but there's really a very thick line between these two things. Orientation identifies someone based on who that individual is romantically, physically, sexually, and or affectionally attracted to. And it does not refer to how someone expresses themselves in regards to gender. This is very, very important, because stereotypes and things that are common to be heard in the LGBT community is, you don't look gay, you don't talk gay. Well, what, she has long fingernails or she has long hair. It's almost as if the orientation somehow is confused with a gender expression or a gender identity. Our gender is socially constructed. There are many different places in the world. Every continent, with the exception of Antarctica, recognizes gender outside of the binary in certain cultures. I mean, when we talk about the binary, we're talking about female and male only. You have the Chukchi, which is in Siberia. They are nomadic shamans, and they embrace a third gender. They're typically born biologically male, but they take on the social roles of females. They marry men, but they also are not subjected to the social constraints that women are subjected to. Then you have the Mahu, which is in the islands. They are biologically male or female, but they inhabit a gender role somewhere between or encompassing both male and female gender roles. And then you have the Nadlihi and the Daibe, and they are both Navajo. The Dadlihi are two-spirited, biologically born male, but they embody both the masculine and feminine spirit, which is very important to understanding that if you're working with Native American clients, it is not embodying necessarily an identity, it is embodying a spirit. So this is something for them that is spiritually based. And then the Daiba is a two-spirited person who is biologically born female that embodies a more masculine spirit. Again, when it comes to gender, how someone does or does not identify or expresses themselves. So when we talk about gender, we're talking about whether or not someone expresses themselves as female, whether they identify themselves as female, or if they're identifying themselves as male or identifying themselves as male. But it's not biologically based. A lot of times when we fill out intake forms, something to be mindful of as a professional is that we put on their gender, male or female. That could have a lot of different meanings to people. Sex would be a more preferred term, but even then, it's really wanting to sit down with a client and find out what gender they identify with, because just because they check a box doesn't mean they fit into that box. And then it doesn't refer to attraction. Just because someone is a male to female transgender individual does not mean that that individual is going to be attracted to men in a heterosexual kind of way. It means that that person identifies as a female and has transitioned to a female. There are male to female transgender individuals who seek out relationships with females. There are female to male individuals who seek out relationships with males. It has nothing to do with orientation. That does not influence whether or not they transition. So again, it does not give way to one's affectional orientation. You cannot determine whether or not someone is lesbian, gay, or bisexual based on their gender or gender identity. And so this is the gender unicorn. I love the gender unicorn. I would highly suggest you guys, you can download the graphic by TSER. And it breaks down the differences between gender identity, gender expression, your sex assigned at birth, who you're physically attracted to, and who you're emotionally attracted to. And this is something that you can do yourself, where you can go through and you mark off who you are identified as. Do you identify yourself as a female? Do you identify yourself as a male? Do you identify yourself as other? Gender expression, how do you express? So it kind of shows you on the outside. And gender expression is actually something that's very unique to the individual. And a lot of people get gender identity and gender expression confused. And so you can have an individual who their gender identity, say, is female, and they were assigned a male at birth, but they express themselves both femininely and masculinely. They could wear a skirt with a men's blouse and have a full beard and wear makeup. That is their gender expression. It has nothing to do with how they're identifying, but how they're expressing themselves. Who you're physically attracted to, women, men, other, and emotionally attracted to. And this is interesting because some people confuse physical and emotional attraction. And again, if you read more in depth, which I would really encourage, into LGBTQ identities and this idea of affectional orientation, they have like your affectional orientation, your emotional orientation. And so, some people may find themselves to be emotionally more attracted to women, more physically attracted to men. How does that interplay? How does that interplay with their relationships? And so when we're approaching orientation and gender, first of all, it's not a bomb. I feel like a lot of times it's made a big deal out of. We tend to feel like we need to skirt around the idea of orientation and gender. We're worried about making the wrong assumptions. We're worried about, well, what if I ask this person if they're gay and they're not gay, and then they're going to be offended. But it's important to just remember that it's not a bomb. And even if you know someone's affectional orientation, if you know someone's gender identity and you have something you don't understand, ask them to explain more. Most people, if you come at them from wanting to genuinely understand them, there's no reason to be uncomfortable. It's no different than counseling anyone else and asking them to explain a little bit more about what they're talking about. But avoid assumptions. So you don't want to find yourself in a position where you're assuming someone is straight, or that you're assuming someone is gay, or if someone tells you that they are transitioning from female to male, now you're assuming that they're a lesbian. You want to make sure that you ask all the right questions. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're just guessing, or basing someone's experience off of an experience that you've had with another client. And there's no one size fit all to affectional orientation or gender identity, which kind of goes back to not making those assumptions. Like, you cannot find yourself in a position where you are assuming something about a person based on their gender identity or affectional orientation. And again, if you don't know, ask. So what is a question that, and you guys will have to speak because I can't see the chat box, but what's a question you would have that would be very uncomfortable for you to ask if you were dealing with a client that's gender identity or affectional orientation didn't match your own?
Are you asking what would make us feel uncomfortable asking as a counselor?
As a counselor or a person, I mean, I
As
think
a
dealing in
person
your,
in general?
yeah, yeah, in general, I mean, because we bring our authentic selves to the counseling realm. So
I would
yeah, that would be
say
great.
I would say asking anything having to do with any gender reassignment surgeries.
Hmm.
Um, that would make me uncomfortable just asking about it.
So when you're talking about gender reassignment surgeries, you're talking about top surgery, bottom surgery, and
Correct.
things like that.
Yeah.
Um, and so in general, in conversations with people that have had reassignment surgery, one of the things I've found is that if it's not pertinent to the conversation, that is a lot of times things that they prefer not to have to answer questions about. And so if it's pertinent to the conversation, if it's, two individuals that are discussing something because maybe one individual is also considering surgery, it wouldn't be as taboo of a subject. But many individuals that I've talked to that have transitioned, they find it rude just simply based on the fact that they feel like you're asking them if they are a real blank. Are you a real woman? Are you a real man? Because you don't have this or you don't have that anymore. But I mean, that's a really great starting point for sure. Who else? Are y'all just comfortable people? I mean, I'm just saying.
Well, I
Y'all
mean,
are.
this is Ash. Ash, this is Dr. Solley. I am pretty comfortable. I think
Oh yeah.
what I would be most uncomfortable, and I'm not even sure it's an ask, but I guess it would be an answer is, like how I would respond if somebody were to specifically ask me, like, what kinds of experiences I'd had with, and I'm using air quotes, and I'm not on camera, with somebody like me. Um, but, I mean, that's like my off the cuff, like that's the first thing that comes to mind. And yet, I guess as a counselor, I mean, I train you guys how to answer that question, but I think it would still engender some like, how do I answer that question? For me, except just asking them like you know, what would my answer mean depending on what the answer was, and also being kind and honest.
And I think that's another great point to bring up, is that a lot of these points are important. Like your comfortableness with this particular community is important because you don't know who they've been to before they've gotten to you. And when we look at state laws and when we look at, and I don't want to get too far out in left field, but when you look at state laws based on conversion therapies, for instance, not very many states have outlawed this. It is still perfectly legal to practice it, even if the ACA, APA, and all of these other professional organizations say, you can't do that. We will not, we don't support that. But it is still legal in many states and people can get away with practicing it. So it's important to realize that they could have been exposed to this. Even if they have not, another thing to be acutely aware of is the minority stress model, which is basically where you have to concern yourself with the messages that people of all minority groups are getting from their macro systems and their micro systems. What direct forms of homophobia are they being exposed to, or biphobia? What are they being exposed to in the community as well? A lot of people, just because the LGBTQ community has a rainbow and we like to think we promote love and acceptance, there is still a lot of problems within the community where discrimination and prejudice is concerned, and that can be racial prejudice, that can be transphobia, bi erasure. All of these things come into play, and so you do want to ask those questions. Even for me, as I identify my affectional orientation as lesbian, my gender identity is gender fluid. But if I was to sit down with a client who is bisexual or bi-affectional, I would want to ask them, you know, what it was like to sit down with me, because there is a lot of dismissiveness that goes on where the bi community is concerned. They're not really gay. They're pinned as being promiscuous. So again, I think that's a really great thing to bring up is it's uncomfortable and it's hard to ask, but you do want to make sure that you're opening the door for that honest conversation. And so now we're going to talk about why this matters. When a professional assumes that their clients are heterosexual, it leaves clients with a feeling of invisibility. And so when I came across this, the first thing that popped into my mind, and when I talk about assumptions, I really hope you guys recognize that I'm talking about microaggressions and things that you're not doing on purpose, or things that as people we don't do on purpose. But one of the first things that popped into my mind was the first person I came out to when I was in high school was my best friend. We didn't talk for 6 months after that, and I was like, she really hates me. And when we reconnected and I asked her why she stopped talking to me, she said, because I thought that I could see that. We've known each other our whole lives. I should have known that about you, but I just thought you were like me. And so sometimes we do that. We walk around and we assume that other people's experiences match our experiences. And no one is immune to that. In case studies, a lot of times I will project my own life onto a case study when there's not more information given, when it's just a very basic, this person came in and this is the situation. It's what we do. But it's being extremely careful as a professional not to make that assumption. And there's a lot of distrust within the community that coming out has the potential to cause them to lose their provider. And so that is also something to be mindful of, and to recognize that, again, just because the ACA has said that certain states' laws are not ethical does not mean that that makes individuals in the LGBTQ community feel safe. Not having that safe space, or being fearful that they'll lose their provider, or not even that they'll lose them, but it will change the relationship they have with their counselor, is very real, and it is very daunting. As counselors, we want to open the door for a safe space and a space of sharing. And the problem is that if you can't get that safe space established, then you can really put up a barrier that you never meant to put up with your clients. And then there's the fear that their orientation or identity may be pathologized. This is a huge one. Up until, I believe it was 1973, being lesbian, gay, or bisexual was actually considered a mental disorder. More recently, in the DSM-5, we have finally kind of dropped a little bit of the stigma associated with being transgender. Gender dysphoria, for a long time, my own bias about gender dysphoria led me to use the term transgender and gender dysphoria almost as an interchangeable thing. Like, an individual that's transgender has to have gender dysphoria. And because of that misinformation, a lot of transgender individuals are very turned off by the community. I cannot tell you how many times, if mental health comes up in any group that I'm a part of that has to do with the LGBTQ community, how many transgender individuals do not trust the mental health field. They feel like going and seeking out mental health services is saying there is something wrong with them. It is almost a slap in the face to the identity that they identify with, because just as a result of them identifying as an opposite sex than what was designated at birth doesn't make anything wrong with them. But that's not how they see it. And if you think about it, if a woman went to have a breast augmentation, she could go see a plastic surgeon and have a breast augmentation done. For a transgender individual to alter their body, they had to jump through these flaming hoops of getting evaluated, then, you have to sign up for this many sessions and you have to make sure that you're not this and you're not that. And it's almost as if seeking out something wrong with this person in a very subliminal way, saying, well, there's no way that someone that was biologically born a man would want to transition into a woman, or that someone that was biologically born a female would want to transition into a male. And again, that goes to the lack of understanding of orientation and identity, and it leads to resistance from members of the community when seeking help. A lot of times, if they don't feel like you understand them, or if you don't fit into their space, they don't want to allow you in. And it's not that I feel the community is actively trying to block people out and not accept that help. It's just that you open yourself up to all of the prior things that we just went over when you disclose. There's not a lot of laws that protect the LGBTQ community. And when seeking help, again, you could lose your provider if you come to them and that's disclosed. And again, it's pathologizing things. Statistically, there are higher instances of certain mental health issues within the community. And so instead of looking at it as where did this start, how did this happen, some may feel like it's being attributed to their orientation. And so now we'll talk about LGBTQ and mental health. And so they are 3 times more likely to experience generalized anxiety disorder and or depression. And again, there's a lot of individuals or a lot of research that kind of ties this anxiety and depression in with that minority stress model. Like when you start looking at all of this information that you're getting in from the larger scale, and then you start thinking about the forms of rejection that individuals may be experiencing at home or throughout their life, this can lead to both of these disorders. And again, it's that playing in your mind that, oh, well, it must be true. They are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide and 8 times more likely if they're rejected by their family after coming out. And again, this goes back to why a lot of them don't seek help. When we really kind of break this down and think about if our own family doesn't want us, why would we go seek out help from someone else? Why would we go outside of the family to go find help if we weren't accepted by those who are supposed to love us the most? And then notice this is LGB, this is not LGBT. Transgendered individuals are 60% more likely to experience suicidal ideation. Now, the thing about transgender individuals is that you have to, a lot of times it's not accurate, because even post-death, if they commit suicide, there still may be mislabeling in obituaries. When the families claim the body, they may decide that instead of this individual who wanted to be a female, they're going to have them listed as a male. In certain states, they don't allow you to change your gender identifier. And so then you go into, compared with only 5 to 10% of the general population, 20 to 30% of LGBTQ individuals abuse drugs. And this can be attributed to a number of things. A lot of times LGBTQ individuals, they seek out that belongingness. And when they seek out belongingness, they're more apt to seek it out in spaces that are targeted toward them. And so, again, I kind of reflect back to where I grew up. There was not an LGBT center for 3 hours in any direction, but there was a bar. And so a lot of the LGBTQ community would go to this bar. And when you're in that environment, you're exposed to drugs, you're exposed to the alcohol, and you're mixing all of these things that are unhealthy. And so as mental health care providers, we need to go where our population is and learn to understand them. After the Polk shooting, one instructor had talked about going to the clubs in Orlando where they knew that members of the community would be. That's how you reach them. And now we're going to talk about being affirming. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is have something that advertises that your office is affirming. You would not believe the small difference this makes. If you own a private practice, if you work for an organization and you're going to be seeing LGBTQ clients, put something up and advertise yourself as being affirming. And that's not just putting it on your website. That's not just putting it on your Psychology Today profile. That is going the extra step to put a little sticker such as hate-free zone up in the sign-in window. Let people know. That is being an active ally. You are actively doing something to show other people that you don't care if they like it or not, that you're supporting this community. One of the things that I have that I've made sure I had up during my practicum and that I'll put up when I start seeing clients at my internship site, I have 2 magnets. One of them says hate-free zone. The other one says safe space. And if you need any of that, you can go to gleason.com, which is going to be on our resources page. And they have all kinds of little things that you can get, just little stickers that you can put up that make a huge difference. Again, avoid microaggressive language. When you're going through an intake process and you're sitting across from a woman, don't assume she has a husband if she filled out, married on her intake paperwork. Ask questions. If that means having intake paperwork that is completely comprised of blanks, if that means sitting down and going through the paperwork with them to make sure that you're getting everything right, it's very, very important to avoid that language. One of the things that I learned here recently at a site that I did a presentation at for domestic violence was that they had to fill out in their intake paperwork male, female. But one alteration that they were willing to do was the male, female checkbox has to go for funding from the government. They have to have certain things to get that paperwork just right. But one adjustment they were willing to make was we'll fill out the paperwork that we have to turn into the state, that we have to turn into the federal government. But what we can do is after they fill out that paperwork or we go through that paperwork, we can go through and ask them, okay, so you said, your biological sex is male. Okay. What is your gender? How do you identify? And so to take up the time to really get to know how that person identifies. And again, that opens up a world of possibilities for questions and for understanding. Because again, it goes back to being genuine. If you genuinely are asking someone a question because you want to understand them better, a lot of times they're going to respond to you in a way to help you do that. Be self-aware of signals that you may be sending. So be aware of your tiny things that give way to your uncomfortableness. That's something that from Res 1 on that we're taught is, to give our little nonverbal cues. But let's face it, some of us have nonverbal cues and we don't mean to have nonverbal cues, and our clients are going to pick up on that. And it's not just like sitting there thinking in the back of your head, well, I'm uncomfortable, but I'm not going to show it. Clients aren't dumb and they will pick up on, an air of that they're not comfortable with this. If it's something just as simple as the way you adjust their body when you tell them something or a change on your face. Be comfortable with your own orientation and gender identity. You have to be comfortable with yourself if you're going to be comfortable with anyone else. A lot of times you'll hear if someone is very staunchly opposed to the LGBTQ community, a lot of the rebuttal is typically, well, that's internalized homophobia or whatever. But no matter what it is, you have to be comfortable with your own orientation and gender identity. And know what your clients need in terms of emotional and social support. You want to have resources available for clients. And for me, it's super important to make sure that you don't just look on the web and say, oh, well, this is, if you have clients who go to church, well, this church says that it's, gay affirming. So you have to get out there and beat the pavement and go in and see for yourself. Because if not, you can send your client somewhere that is not what you thought it was, which means it's not what they need, and you can now foster a distrust in that relationship. Um, the community I grew up in had 130 churches. 2 of them were advertised as affirming, but none of them even advertised it on their websites. If you went in, it wasn't like you didn't walk in the doors and think, oh, well, here's a small little pride flag that says that it's okay for me to be here. There was nothing like that. So how affirming they are, again, is questionable at best. And then recognize the need for some clients to be validated for sharing. When some clients come to you and they come out to you with their orientation, or if they come out to you about their gender identity, they need that affirmation in their life. Some of them you may be able to recognize that, oh, well, maybe they don't necessarily need me to be like, thank you so much for telling me that. But just to be like, oh, okay. It's reading the person that you're sitting with. Especially where gender identity is concerned, your office should be a space for them to also be able to try on. For them to, if they're not comfortable in their day-to-day life, dressing the way that makes them comfortable, for them to be able to come to your office and say, okay, well, if I wear this anywhere else, people are going to look at me and say, that's a man in a dress. But if I come here and I'm dressed like that, my counselor will say, she looks really pretty today. It's knowing what your clients need, and that's paying attention to very small details. And so that kind of wraps up my presentation. Any questions?
I have a question. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the LGBTQ community is untrusting of mental health services in general. What can we do as counselors to get them more comfortable, to get them to accept and seek out mental health if needed?
That's a great question. I think personally, it's making those small adjustments when you have an office space that you're putting up something that advertises yourself as affirming and as an ally. I also think that one of the most important things that I've ever heard, I asked that same question to a guy who was Puerto Rican, and I said, well, how can I be an active ally as, a white female? How can I do this? And he said, find people that look like them and put them in a position of power to talk. And so one thing that I usually encourage people is if you can find a respected member of the LGBT community. In Alabama, ours is a drag queen named Ambrosia Starling. If you are gay in Alabama and on Facebook, you're probably friends with her, and people respect her. And she encourages overall well-being. She fights for civil rights for people in the LGBTQ community in Alabama. She's very, very active. And so that's finding someone that the community can identify with and putting them in a place to say, hey, if you need mental health services, I know this person. It's networking, it's getting into those communities.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Ashley,
Yeah.
this is Dr. Hudson.
Hey.
I guess my question for you is, as you're thinking about your peers who will be future counselors working with this population, what would be the one thing that you'd want them to take away from this presentation that they could begin to either begin the process of understanding the LGBTQ community or in treating the LGBT community? I guess what I'm saying is kind of what would be the one thing that you would want them to do as they're walking away from your presentation?
I would 100% probably say to look into your local organizations, look and see where the closest LGBT center is to you, and get in there and ask questions, get to know them. Advertise yourself as someone that wants to understand them. And even if it's not a population that you want to specifically work with, what's important to realize is that the mental health needs of the LGBTQ community will mean that you will see not just one, but you will see several of them throughout your career. And it's understanding that just because they're in counseling, they may not be in counseling because of their orientation or gender identity, but it can and probably will eventually come up. And it's being able to sit in comfort with that.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yeah. Hi, Ash. This is Dr. Rush Wilson. I have a question for you, too. Undergraduate, I did some academic coursework on transgender sex reassignment surgeries and phalloplasty and retoidioplasty and that type of stuff. And then later worked with someone very closely who became a really good friend of mine who had experienced that particular process. One of the things that came up is when someone has a curiosity about those types of surgeries and practices, which may be a natural curiosity for some, particularly if that's a clinical population with whom you work, the idea that now that we have access to YouTube, that you can just go online and learn a little bit about the clinical and medical aspects of the surgeries instead of subjecting someone to your own personal curiosities and objectifications. What do you think of that?
I think that that's a really good point. And to be completely honest, that's a lot of actually just about any reassignment that I've seen where they have had like a medical stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would really be the preferred method of finding out what all that entails. Because again, if you're talking to a person, it's going to depend on their comfort level sharing. And that's something that, again, it kind of goes back to if you ask someone, well, what's top surgery like or what's bottom surgery like, their misunderstanding of that information could be you questioning their identity and their expression.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi, Ash. This is Dr. Crowley.
Hola. Hey.
I had a question for you regarding some terminology. I know you covered some terminology earlier on in your presentation, and so one of the things that I've heard a few times is gender reassignment surgery today, and we generally are referring to that as gender affirmation surgery now, that we're working from a more positive perspective. So as we know, this has been called everything from sex reassignment surgery to gender reassignment surgery. I'm wondering what suggestions you would have for some of your peers regarding the change of terminology and the importance of staying up to date with it.
I think the importance of staying up to date with changing terminology kind of stems back, like when we were talking about, not using the term hermaphrodite, but instead you're using the term intersex. Staying up with the terminology means that you're actively participating and actively investing your time in understanding the community. And so those small things can make a really big difference when someone's talking to you. So I feel like if you use the correct term when instead of saying, sex change, you use the more clinically accepted term, then they know that you're investing your time and yourself into the community. It's being an active ally.
Thank you. And I do have one kind of related follow-up question is, do you have any particular resources that you would recommend for your peers to help them find an appropriate place to kind of get more recent terms or to kind of verify some changing terms to see what might be most acceptable today?
Yes, I will put in the chat box different websites that you guys can go to. I apologize, I thought they were at my PowerPoint, but I will make sure to get them to you. chat box that you can go to. So they are in the back. We have, of course, Algebra, Gleason, HRC, NAMI, and then there'll also be the website, PBS has a website that I'm going to put in there, and it goes over the multiple different gender identities that you can find outside of the binary in different cultures. I enjoyed it because it breaks down more than a lot of times when you think about two-spirited individuals, you're just like, oh, they're Native American. But it actually pulls up the groups, their preferred terms based on their biological sex. And it tells you a little bit more about how they're regarded in the community. So if you're interested in third genders or, genders outside the binary in general, I would really suggest that one.
Ash, this is Dr. Solley. I really appreciated the presentation and also the resources. It's interesting. I'm doing a presentation later on in the day, and many of these concepts sort of transmute into that. And literally was just trying to find a good resource. The issue of linguistics and language and lexicon, I think, is one that can really hang people up. I know for myself, there have been times when I don't know that I know what the term is that's being referred to, and I'm not just like the the LGBTQ plus terms, but what exactly is a this or what is that? What do those things mean? And I think at times I have very definitely used, I've probably been extremely microaggressive because honestly of ignorance. And I think as counselors, it's so important for us to continue in the quest and, like you said, recognize too that the terms are always changing and keep abreast of it, but also to be able to be, I guess, give ourselves some grace. And I think that how we do that as counselors is really just making sure that whoever it is that we're talking to knows that we can be corrected. Like, we're not above the learning. Really meeting them, whoever it is, them, the they that is in front of us in their space, and being that open receptacle to, without putting them in the role of having to be the teacher or the trainer, but like if we say something that for whatever reason is offensive or is inadvertently a wrong term, much like Dr. Crowley just really aptly role modeled here, that we be the receptor to that and go, thank you. I appreciate that. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think as entry-level counselors, people are so afraid of doing things wrong anyway, that it can be not just entry-level, sometimes very sage ones. But I just kind of wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, and I think that that's super important as well. There's, I'm going to put the title of the book in the chat box as well. But it's a book, it's Affirmative Counseling with LGBTQI plus individuals. And that's one thing that they talk about is even in the community, like it's so hard sometimes to stay abreast of the new terminology coming out. And one thing that I kind of find myself thinking when I see conversations or engage in conversations with individuals that are like, well, why do they have to be pansexual? Why can't they just say that they're bisexual? And kind of watching that, I'm like, well, how does it hurt you to affirm an individual? Because that's what they're telling you. They're telling you that's how they feel. And so just like with what Dr. Solley just said, it's creating that space. And, I did a presentation completely on non-microaggressive language like a week and a half ago. And I'm extremely Southern. I'm from South Alabama. I was taught yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. And it's a hard habit for me to break. And after the presentation, a lady told me, or an individual, see, there it goes. An individual told me, hey, thank you so much for the presentation. And I turned around, and before I even thought about it, I said, yes, ma'am. And I was like, oh, you did it. Like, you just completely contradicted your entire presentation because you're using a gender identifier with someone and you don't know if that's their identity. And so it is like it's giving yourself that space to forgive yourself and creating a space for, clients to be comfortable in saying, no, that's not how I identify, or, to give them that space. I think that's a really good point. Thank you. Is there anyone else? Yes.
I was just going to say we're at time.
Okay.
Are you open if anyone else has questions to email you? Would that be okay with you?
Yes, ma'am. I'll put my email in the chat box.
Okay, great. Everyone, I'd like to invite you to Dr. Nealon's presentation. She'll be doing our keynote address, and Dr. Nealon is the president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and we have been very lucky that she has agreed to come in and talk to us. And her topic is, sorry, it's going to take me just a second here to pull it up. Her topic is integrating healthcare, connections between physical illness and mental health. So I'd love for you all to join us. You would need to click on the title in the schedule at a glance. It's actually in Dr. LA's Blue Jeans room. So hopefully I'll see you all there. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Ash.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Ash.
Thank you.